Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Mastering Your Backlist, Digging for Treasures in the Past, the masterclass from Firebrand Technologies. Really appreciate you joining me today. And, hopefully everything that you see today will be interesting and helpful. That's my job. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to run through some really interesting things about the backlist, how it works, and how to get more out of it. As we're going through today, if you have questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. I'm watching the chat actively as I'm going, and I'll try to catch those as we go, or also at the end, of course, as well. And without further ado, let's actually dive right in or dig right in and talk about digging for treasures in the past. So in 2006, I was invited to go on an archaeological dig in Israel. It's probably one of the most interesting experiences of my life. I really want to go back and do it again. I went with a group of master's students from a couple of different Christian universities, and we dug at Tel Tamar, which is south of the Dead Sea. It's one of the cities that Solomon built up as a stronghold when he became king. So when he was, if you could do me a favor, if you could mute yourself if you're not talking, that'd be great. Thank you. So after 5 days of digging, we had dug down quite a bit in the area we were digging in. You can see this tree stump in the middle. We had dug around that tree stump and around kind of the walls and things that were found underneath it. And this was in an area that had been filled in. So there was a lot of really interesting kind of special stuff going on in this area where, people had taken dirt from other places and just dumped it all into the bottom of like walls and fortress areas to try to build up the ground. And so we found pottery sherds from all different time periods, as far back as David and as recent as the time of Jesus, Nabatean pottery from that time, first century time period. So this was a really great experience, and I bring it up because obviously we're talking about digging into treasures from the past. So my goal today is to help you understand how you can dig into your backlist and find the treasures that have hidden value. There are titles in your backlist that, with a little bit of TLC, can get better sales and may actually lead to a much more profitable company. Digging into your backlist can be rewarding and hopefully not as dirty of a process as actually digging in the dirt. I don't think the jeans that I was wearing ever recovered from the ground in dirt that we had as part of that archaeological dig. So let's dig in. Why is your backlist important? Now, you might be thinking, oh, of course I know my backlist is important, but I think the numbers are really compelling. Things are changing. The market is constantly changing, and there's good reason why we should be going back and looking at the backlist. So first of all is online sales. Online sales are increasing at really big rates. There's no official numbers on this at the moment, but Kristen McLean from MPD Book, the industry analyst on the book side at MPD, gave me her personal estimation on this just a couple of weeks ago. So in 2019, the estimate of online versus offline sales was about 50-50, and that was up from 2010 when it was about 80-20. And during the pandemic shutdowns, Kristen estimates that roughly 15% of the share of total book buying shifted from buying in-store to buying online. And that was across a whole bunch of different retailers online, not just Amazon. Now, this is a little less than what we saw in the overall market, where it was roughly a 20% shift toward online buying at the height of the pandemic. Now, in 2021, so far, this has reversed itself, just like the online offline has reversed itself in the general market. But the online share is still about 8% above where it was in 2019. So we're basically at about 58% of online, of total books being sold online. And that's a big deal. When you think about how people purchase things online, it's different than how they buy in a store. Meanwhile, during the same time period, we see the backlist sales are increasing. So frontlist sales have eroded kind of slowly over the years, along with the kind of decades of declining high-priced, big footprint mall and suburban bookstore locations. So when you think about how books are being sold, this has been kind of a progressive change in the backlist. Back in 2004, it was at 51% of sales, and in 2020, In 2019, that went to 63% of sales. And it was kind of a slow growth and a little bit of plateauing over the years, but really it was about 2% per year or so on average. But then in 2020, the shutdowns caused that number to jump 4 points up to 67% of book sales. And the numbers through October 2nd of this year of 2021 show that the backlist sales now account for 69%. So we've added another 2% of total book sales as backlist. So as backlist sales increase, publishers are trying to figure out what it actually means to make a book succeed. In 2020, or actually earlier this year, BookNet Canada did a study on data from 2019 and 2020 in Canada. And they looked at sales for books across all different subjects. And they found that across all subjects, front list books sell best, making up about 37% of total sales in 2019 and 2020, about 35% in 2020. And then they looked at the other books that were also selling during that time period, and they looked at how old they were. So titles that were 2 to 5 years into their backlist. So this is basically between 3 and 6 years of total activity from pub date, make up about 25% of all sales in 2019 and 26% in 2020. And that's a really interesting trend. The idea that during that 2 to 5 year time frame, you can actually see more sales even than in the first year potentially after the book goes into the backlist. When you look at fiction, the trend doesn't really apply because fiction is much more heavily weighted to front list sales. But for nonfiction, it really followed the same pattern very closely. So if you publish nonfiction, it's something that you'll want to look out for. And I can give you the link to this report if you haven't seen it on the BookNet Canada website after the talk. Another thing to discuss, though, is what we call the magic number. So if you want a really interesting read about this phenomenon, I highly recommend you check out Todd Satterston's blog at Bard Press about the magic number. Bard Press is a nonfiction business publisher, and they publish basically one book per year. In looking at the study, though, like their books are very successful. So Todd went and built a study basically around business and self-help titles. So he built a list of about 6,700 titles in the business and self-help categories published between 2012 and 2015. In that 3-year time frame, he looked at not just books that were he looked at those books that were published in that time frame, but looked at their total sales over the lifetime of their book. What he found was that a book has to sell more than 10,000 copies in the first year, or it's going to be difficult to ever exceed that sales level in its lifetime. And if you look here, titles that have less than 10,000 for first year unit sales make up the vast majority of the titles that were assessed, 89% of them, but only 11% of those made more than $10,000 in the subsequent years that they were available. However, when you reach at least 10,000 total first year sales, about 7.4% of all the titles that he was looking at, 42% of those titles actually go over 25,000. And the same trend applies as you go up and up and up. Basically, you set your value at 50-50 chance of hitting the next cohort of sales. Now, this is a really interesting study. I think the blog post does a much better job than I've done explaining it. But that's a good reason to go and look at your backlist and try to also get those first year sales up so that your backlist can succeed even more. Okay, so that's the why, right? There's lots of why here. Let's talk about how do you find titles? How do you actually know which titles matter? How do you decide which titles to work on? So obviously, sales numbers, digging into your sales can really help you see which titles are doing well and which ones are not. However, it's not just about those that are doing well compared to other titles in your list. Remember the magic number in the BookNet Canada study when you're looking at your sales, and look at each book within its own context. What did it sell in the first year? What were its sales 1 year after in the first year after it was front list, in the first year of the backlist? If the title is in years 2 to 5, what's the trajectory of its sales in that time period? Is it going up or is it going down? And if sales are going down, that's kind of to be expected over the course of time. But if they're going up, then that might be an indication that it's catching a second wind or there's something else going on. And this is why watching your backlist titles is so important. You want to catch those trends as they occur so that you can build on the trends for that specific book. So look at the book in context of itself and see what it's doing on its own. The second thing that I would recommend when you're trying to find what titles to work on, what titles to do something with, is to look at the bestseller rank on Amazon and track that rank over time. So sales rank is calculated based on all-time sales of a product, where recent sales are weighted more heavily than older sales. Now, Amazon doesn't actually reveal what the algorithm is, but the number of sales that you make in a certain time frame is very important. So sales rank is important because it's tied to discoverability. If you can increase your sales rank, it can help you in a lot of different ways. It can help you become more visible in less competitive categories. It's not just about the book categories that you're in, or the main book category. I'm numbered in the top 10,000 in the books category. Of course, that's important. But when you're thinking about visibility, you want your book to be ranking highly in as many subcategories as you can, especially the ones that are pertinent to your book and that, if possible, less competitive. We'll talk about that more later. So it can help you also, getting your sales rank up, can help you see the effectiveness of your promotional activities. So as you start to see, you start to put promotional activities out there, you can start to see whether they're working or not based on the sales rank that you're watching. Also, watching your sales rank can help you potentially earn a bestseller badge, which tells shoppers to pay attention to your product. The more you get people to pay attention, the more visible it is, and also the kind of the eye-catching things that people are looking for. Those are obviously very important for sales rank. So if your book sells once every couple of weeks or once in a while, especially if sales are inconsistent, then your sales rank patterns will look something like this. You'll see a big jump and then a big trough that comes afterward, kind of a slow decline into a trough, and then a big jump and then a decline into a trough. That's kind of a standard pattern that we've seen as tracking sales rank over the course of the last 3 to 5 years. What you want to look for, though, is these places along that path where things tighten up, where the trough doesn't get to actually go down as far, right? When you see that pattern tightening up, like right in here, that's what you're looking for when you're thinking about what backlist title should be paying attention to and when. You'll notice in this title's history, there were a couple of times where that happened. We had a really big trough, and then it jumped really high because it got some good sales just in a day or so, and then it stayed up for a little while and then came back down again as things slowed down a little bit. And then you see it again and again a little further on. But you'll notice the upward trend because that's actually those troughs and valley, the heights and valleys are actually working in its favor over the course of time. So if the sales are fairly consistent, but not increasing at all, then you might see something more like this. We're kind of seeing a pattern of, okay, this is just I get a sale, I get a sale, I get a sale. You're not letting that trough capability kind of happen, right? You're not seeing the trough really get the ability to go, basically. If we zoom in on that, drill in on that, you can see the long slopes are really not having time to play out. So this is a great place for a backlist title to be in. Don't knock consistent sellers. This is actually really good. What you want to do in a consistent seller pattern is, if at all possible, try to build more interest and make those consistent sales be more consistent, basically, just again, to tighten up the number of sales you're getting in a shorter period of time, which raises that overall sales rank and can give you a little bit more of a push. So again, if we're thinking more about this was this jump right here in the kind of general sales rank or average sales rank was definitely a change in the pattern. We want to see that also in these kinds of patterns as well. Tighten that up and hopefully get better sales in a shorter period of time that will raise that average across the board. Then this is also what you want to see, right? So this is what you want to see when you're looking at titles to focus some attention on, is the sales rank that's increasing at the moment. In this example, the sales rank is increasing over time. We can see that with the trend line, but notice that there are times when it just jumps up and tightens again, right? Those are likely related to advertising campaigns or some other event that causes more people to buy the book in that season. So you want to be able to catch those times that's happening and take advantage of. And you want to see when it jumps up and stays a little consistent, and if at all possible, grab it at the front end. So another sign to look for when you're deciding which titles to mine, which titles to dig into in your backlist, is basically titles that are relevant to current events and trends and topics. And this may take a little bit more social awareness than some of us have, but the goal is to catch things before they happen, if at all possible, or at least while those things are on the upward trend. And this is something you hear all the time, right? Your sources for this kind of information are pretty commonly known. It's news and social media and things like that. Those are important, but for Christian publishers specifically, we're not just limited to news and social media. We can integrate the knowledge that we get from bulk and institutional sales as well, from special sales. Listen to what's being discussed at church. Watch for patterns and topics in other ways, right? What are the things that are happening around you in your community and in the broader community of people that you know by your book that are going to be more interesting than just kind of general news or general social media? If you can, watch for patterns in the topics that are being discussed in sermons from well-known pastors. If you're a denominational publisher, it's even a lot easier. Or if you focus on certain types of books or from a certain perspective, that's going to be easier for you. So there are lots of sources of knowledge, and it's not just the ones that people think of. So when you see a trend, any kind of trend, look at your backlist and see what books might address that topic or benefit the people that are thinking about it. So now we know why the backlist is important, and we've figured out what titles to work on, or at least got a little closer to that. Let's talk about what you can do with these titles once you know what you want to be doing. You want to, you know that you have this list of books you want to go look at, or this one title you want to go take a look at and do something with. What are you going to do first? Now, I'm going to share some general ideas and thoughts about what you can do to help a title get more visibility. None of this is a sure thing. There are no silver bullets in backlist sales, but remember the sales rank. You want to make that sales rank jump up and stay as consistent as you can for as long as you can, since that's what make a book more visible, especially on Amazon. We're talking a lot about Amazon here because that's where a majority of sales happen for a majority of publishers. But these things that we're talking about will also apply to other sources as well, other retailers as well, and other ideas that you're talking about. So obviously, keywords are important. If you listen to any presentation about metadata or anything else in the past 5 years, you probably are tired of hearing about this. But keywords are important because Amazon search algorithms really use them to make books more visible. The keywords that you provide will make a difference in where your book shows up in search results. And you want your book to show up in as many different searches as it possibly can. And this is tied in with that sales rank as well. So if you're working on getting your sales rank better and more consistent on certain titles, having your book show up in more search results and making more people see the book when they do some sort of relevant search is going to be helpful in that goal. So if your book only shows up in search results that contain the name of the book or the author's name, then you're missing out on key discoverability. And that's where keywords can come in and help. In 2020, Nielsen UK released a study on the impact of metadata on book sales. And this was one of 3 or 4 studies of its kind over the course of the last 5 or 6 years that have looked at this issue and tried to figure out how much does metadata actually make an impact. And what they found was that titles with more than 30 keywords in their data feeds had significantly higher average sales than those with fewer than 30 keywords. So if you want to show up in more search results, then you need to add more keywords. That's just the way the process works. Adding more and more relevant keywords is really imperative to discoverability. So let's talk about the practicalities. How many keywords can you provide to Amazon? Well, Amazon's been a little finicky about this over the last few years, and they're not always consistent. So there's a lot of misinformation about how many keywords you're supposed to give them or allowed to give them. I want to give you some background on kind of the history of this, but just realize that we're talking about Onyx feeds, data feeds that are being sent to Amazon through Vendor Central. If you're on Advantage or you're using KDP only or something like that, you may be limited even more than what I'm talking about here as to how many keywords you can provide. But let's talk about the history kind of this. Before 2018, Amazon didn't really have any kind of defined standard. It was kind of understood that they would take as many keywords as you gave to them, typically up to about 2,000 characters or so was what we thought they would do based on testing and what everybody else was looking at. In November 2018, Amazon sent out a message that said, our system limits the length of generic keywords and search term to less than 250 bytes. It's still possible to go over that limit, but if you do, then the search engine will not index any of your entries. And this caused a major kerfluffle in the industry because now Amazon says you can't give more than basically 250 characters in your keyword field in your Onyx file. And if you do, then your book will not be indexed at all. You just like none of your keywords will work. Book will only show up for basically title and author. So at that point, publishers started trying to figure out how to truncate their keywords list to send to Amazon. And we actually did that with our Eloquence on Demand program, just truncating automatically. Then a year later, November 2019, the company just decided that the 250 byte limit doesn't include spaces or punctuation. And they also said that keywords should ideally not be separated by semicolons. And this is a problem because it kind of breaks the industry standard practice. The Onyx recommendation and the Library of Congress recommendations were to add semicolons as separators between words. They also said that individual words in the keywords area shouldn't be repeated in the keywords field, and that's not necessarily a bad idea. If Amazon's limiting your total number of characters to 250, you don't want the same word taking up multiple copies of itself in that limitation. But the semicolons thing was kind of a frustrating situation. And then about 5 months later, in March of 2020. Amazon clarified that the use of semicolons they're accepted for keywords, they're optional. They don't count toward the 250 byte limit. They'll just be ignored. So publishers can continue to submit keywords with semicolons and spaces following best practices, which is great. Okay, so now we're still limited to 250 bytes or characters, but we're able to submit semicolons still. Then in May 2020, May of last year, an Amazon representative told the BISG metadata committee, Amazon ingests up to 210 bytes of data for subject keywords. Everything beyond the limit up to 2,000 bytes is just ignored. It's not used. And if more than 2,000 characters, 2,000 bytes are provided, then the entire Onyx record will be disregarded. So, okay, that's a bigger change as well. Not only they're limiting to 210 bytes, 210 characters, but now they're also saying you can provide more, we'll just ignore anything above that. Well, okay, so that's nice. Now we can go back to providing all of these keywords, but we're limited now to 210 characters. And still, the question remains, what about semicolons and spaces and things like that, which we're assuming are still disregarded. And then October this year came along. It seems like every six to 12 months, there's something that changes. We started receiving reports last month that Amazon was suppressing some titles that had more than 350 characters in their keyword field. Now, this is a weird number because it's not a number we've seen before. The limit was 250 characters total or 2,000 characters total. But they were limiting the characters. They were not allowing the title metadata to be updated. The Onyx files were being rejected. This is apparently a setting on a client record that was set by somebody at Amazon and not announced to anybody else, even internally within Amazon, and apparently led to some internal discussions. And so now there's talk of potentially a plan to provide a metadata guide, maybe as early as next year for publishers. We'll see about that. My recommendation right now is to stay the course. Stick with the 210 bytes, 2,000 total bytes hard limit, or 210 characters, 2,000 characters as a hard limit, and watch your keywords and watch your titles and make sure they're going in. And I know that's probably a lot more information than you wanted to see, but that's where things are going right now. Let's talk about some other things you can do to, again, push your titles out there. Book descriptions. Descriptions really do matter. So having good descriptions are really important. Every single study that's been done, and you'll get a copy of the slides later if you want to see these, but every study shows that descriptions really do matter. When you're doing descriptions, when you're looking at your book descriptions for these older books, try to make them relevant, not outdated. That's one thing with older titles. Sometimes they reference things that are not really true anymore. So check those descriptions for that. If you don't have a lead in, a bold line, a bold paragraph at the top of your description, do that. And also double check and make sure that what's above the fold on Amazon, above that read more click option, the link, make sure that that is above the fold really is something that's eye catching, that's going to be something people care about. Make your descriptions longer. If you can, write 3, 4, 5 paragraphs in there. Some publishers just have one little paragraph. And for a lot of people, when they're thinking about, do I want to buy this book or not, they want to know a little bit more about it. So write it a little bit longer. And add more than just the description to your metadata. If you've got, editorial reviews or excerpts or things like that, those are always good. And all the studies show that the more of that information you provide, the more likely you are to catch the attention of a potential purchaser and do that well. Also, you have the ability to add A+ content to a title. Now, A+ content is normally only available to Vendor Central, Advantage, and Seller Central users who have been approved as brand owners through the Amazon brand registry process, as well as some brands who are part of Amazon's managed selling programs. That's now changing for KDP users. So Amazon used to not let KDP users do it, but publishers that are using KDP now have access to create these titles and connect them to other books they have as well. So I would highly recommend that if you can, get your content set up in with A+ content on the page. It makes a huge difference in how people see your title. In addition to A+ content, being part of the brand registry, if you're able to do that, allows you to create store pages for your books on the Amazon store. So these store pages have very simple addresses, allowing you to use them in marketing and to easily direct customers to them. And then another benefit of the brand registry is the ability to buy sponsored brand ads. These are special ad sections that show up above the search results and point to specific products from your brand. And as you can see here, just like sponsored product ads, you can buy branding for different keywords. And this even allows you, if you want to show your products on pages for competitor titles. So when you're thinking about how you're doing branding and how you're doing advertising, this is really helpful. And while we're on the subject, another key recommendation for this backlisting is increasing your discoverability with advertising. Some publishers seem to get jittery about spending money on advertising on Amazon, but the reality is that advertising is just one of the quickest and easiest ways to get a book noticed by shoppers. Even a small ad budget can reap rewards, especially when combined with other recommendations and other things we're talking about. So don't be afraid to spend money to make money. Watch your spend carefully. Pay attention to the data that you glean from the advertising and dig into the reports and details of the interactions that you get from that and use that to your benefit. One more major thing here, and that's subject categories. So a study released by the Panorama Project in February 2021 shows that genre or category is the most important factor for book purchasing. Genre is basically user-friendly metadata. So subject categories are related in many ways to the sales rank that you're watching. And you can do a lot with your subject categories to help you build the backlist sales. Look at your comp titles, see what categories those are listed in. See if you can get your book listed in categories that might be newer or that have, or categories that are kind of more smaller and you can more effectively compete in. Don't be afraid to change a category that's not working. If you're way down in the 500s in sales rank in a category, no one will ever dig that deep in that category. So look at other categories that might be better suited and a little bit less competitive. When you've made all of these changes, you've done everything that you can do, you really need to watch your titles in the marketplace. Pay attention to everything that's going on. In 2012, BISG commissioned a report on the development, use, and modification of book product metadata. And that study found that 95% of publishers say that their data is altered without their knowledge on retail sites by third parties. But they also found that 36% of publishers are actually going and checking their metadata on retailer sites. Only 36% of publishers were actually spending time looking at their product data. Now, this number probably has changed. I know it has changed in the last 9 years, and I hope that we do a different study, another study on this to see what people are doing now. But it is imperative that you watch your titles in the marketplace. Pay attention to changes that impact your book sales. Look for issues, look for opportunities that are easy to miss if you're not watching. So automated processes can make this much easier. I'm happy to talk to you about that, but watching your titles is really important. So that's what we're talking about with product metadata and all these other things. The goal is to increase your title information, increase your visibility of your books across all of the different platforms you can. And with that, to build those backlist sales. So any questions from anybody, you can unmute yourself if you prefer, and we can actually talk that way, or you can type in the chat, and I'll see your questions in the chat as well. Don't see any questions coming in, and that's perfectly fine. If you do have questions later, if you think of something that you're like, well, what about this situation? I've got a problem with this title. I've got a problem trying to find the right titles to build on my backlist. Let me know. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have. You have my phone number here, my email address. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to do that. And hopefully see you guys again in the coming sessions, and enjoy PubU. It's great to see you all.